period. So that's one of the three things I want to go over with you today. Basically what you're looking at here in terms of the end of the grading period. Remember that the 3 extra professional days before we started on the 17th were supposed to be part of this grading period. That's why it's only 5 weeks long really for you. The next 2 grading periods will be 6 weeks each, but grades close at 3:15. All assignments close at 3:15 on Friday. So we'll go over that and make sure that you're set on that. We'll also go over and make sure that you know about the test, because the test that you should have turned in by Monday at 3:15 is still available as well until tomorrow, but it is already showing up on Aries. So it's about 29% of the grade for this quarter with the assignments that we have. And then we'll start talking about Unit 2. So Unit 2, we'll take a look at basically the Black Death, right? The bubonic plague that struck really, really hard in Europe, depending on where you're at, even parts of Asia, 30 to 70% of a town's population would die from that. We'll look at the Renaissance as well this week. We'll talk about the Reformation and the Glorious Revolution and some of the things that you see throughout Europe next week as we continue on. And then I'll go over the 2 things that you should do next week after you make sure that you have everything done for this grading period. So a couple of things here. First off, if you go to assignments, this is going to list everything for your grade, basically your progress report that comes out next Monday. And I think that they'll be mailed home. Grades are due. And then I think they'll start mailing them out on Monday, which is the 21st, I believe. So last week, if you remember, we went over a couple of things. The difference between a due date and an available until date. The due date is the date that it starts showing up in Aries. Aries is the location where your grade is most up to date. Canvas is just a notification system, really. So you want to check Aries for your current grade. It's updated every day. I do that before I leave, generally around 3:30. The available until date is when you can do the assignment for full credit. And if you notice, all of the assignments that we've had so far, it doesn't matter if it's week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, they're all available until Friday. So you want to make sure that you have points, and it'll tell you if you've turned that in, right? It'll tell you that you've turned that in, and you can check Aries and make sure that your score is correct. The other thing that you want to do, and I sent this out this morning, is I did a full gradebook analysis by student for each assignment. So you want to check and make sure not only did you get credit for the things that you turned in, but also that you had the right score recorded in Aries. And if there's a question, please ask, right? Because you're not here the day-to-day. Checking and being able to see you in person would be a little bit different. Now, as I said, there'll be 2 things that we do with this week's curriculum, but I would not start those until next week and make sure that you've done everything for this quarter, right? So that your progress report is completely up to date. So there's another map. There's 16 map identifications of Europe, 1785 that we need to know. And then I think 3 or 4 questions about the Renaissance and what we talk about today. So it's very, very simple. You'll have more than enough time next week, and you can see that I've really pushed back those dates to even the Friday after we meet the next time, and you can see the available until date is October. So make sure that you get the things that are going to be important in terms of your progress report. Make sure that you get those things done. Any questions on that? Okay, so the second thing that I want to get with you today on is your unit test. Your unit test is still available. So if you click on this, remember that it's only available between 7 and 4, 7 a.m. and 4 p.m., but it's only available until Friday at 3:15 p.m. At that time, it's going to close. Your username is your 6-digit ID. Your password is your network password for your tablet. as well as your school email. Now, a couple of things on that. As I said, it's a hefty percentage of your grade, because if you look at, and I won't show anybody's grade book here, but if you look at your grade book and log in, we had 2 assignments week 1, 2 assignments week 2, 2 assignments week 3. We had the review game week 4 that you could use the Kahoot as many times as you want, and then the test, right? So we had 60 points, actually a little bit more than that, 10, 20, 60, 70, 80. We had 80 points worth of assignments, classwork, and homework. And then on the test, that was worth 30. So you're looking at a hefty percentage. In this period, yet to take the exam a little bit better than period 4, but in this period, in this group here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We've got 9 of you, 9 of the 19 that are in the A through L group that have not taken that test yet. So you want to make sure that you take that test, because it is really a large percentage of your grade, and it's going to be about, it's almost 30%. It's about 29.5% of your grade available. So it can really raise up your grade if you want to get that lower. So if you have any questions on getting to the test, let me know. Remember that you can't exit out of there. So if there's an issue taking the test, you need to email me right away through Canvas or to the school email, so that we can get that reactivated for you, because everything closes at 3:15 and you won't be able to do anything after that. Are there any questions on that portion? Okay, chat room is good. Perfect. Go ahead and open your Canvas page to your home page, and we'll start with this week's stuff and get you done, so that you can check and make sure that you've got everything ready for the end of the quarter, and get you some good grades. So open your Canvas homepage real quick. All righty, so we finished ancient Greece, ancient Rome with the last unit. This unit, we are going to look at the Black Death and the Renaissance. Next week, we'll look at the Reformation, the Glorious Revolution, and get ready for our major revolutions that we talk about: American Revolution, French Revolution in the late 1700s. So a couple of things, and I had mentioned this the past couple of weeks. I did get 2 or 3 messages over the weekend or since the last class meeting about things being unavailable to them in Canvas. And remember, that's because you have to, as you go through, make sure that you clear each module. So the prereq for module 2 is that you have to finish week 1. And the prereq for module 3, which is week 3, is that you have to do weeks 1 and 2. And then, right, obviously last week when we did the review game, the prereqs for week 4 are weeks 1, 2, and 3, which would be modules 1, 2, and 3. So some of you were saying that this test was locked, and somehow, right, you did not go through the modules. One student we had to take all the way back to the beginning. So remember, clearing a module is very, very simple. Just go to your overview page at the start of a module. And when you do that, it is going to bring up what is expected of you that week, right? So this was week 1. We're going to go over Canvas, Go Formative, YouTube channel, how to access that, and Ed Benham. And then when you click next, it's going to take you through that. So there'll be notes available, and everything that we did is going to be available to you again in a digital format. And so you cannot advance to the second module, right, if you haven't completed the first. And so when we're in module 5, if you haven't completed 4, 3, 2, and 1, you can't advance through that. That's why you won't get this blue submit button, and you want to make sure that you've done that. So if you're getting that error, you're being frustrated by some sort of message like that, that is most likely the reason why. So looking at what we're going to look for this week is we want to understand what the Renaissance is about and why that time period is important to us. Be able to explain the changes in society due to the thoughts and the movements in the time period of the Renaissance. Understand why Europe becomes the center of the time period, and it dates back to the ideas of Greek and Roman philosophers, as well as the invention of the movable type printing press, which allows for a much more efficient and faster way to create books, which obviously spread ideas and thoughts about politics and religion and things that are going on in people's life. And then there's 16 identifications that you'll need to know on the map of Europe as it relates to 1785. So if you're in your Canvas, go ahead and click on that overview page, and that has the information that we just did, and then go ahead and click next and get to this page right here. All right, so a couple of things in terms of what's going on in the world. So during this time period, and we're looking probably mid 1300s through the 1500s, probably, as far as we know, one of the world's most devastating epidemics in human history happens, and that is the spreading of the bubonic plague, which in Europe was known as the Black Death. Estimations, right, we don't really have census from that time, but estimations are that there were 75 to 200 million people that died from this plague. Scholars figure that most likely, right, it originates in probably the western parts of China and spreads to Europe via that Silk Road, which is the trade route from Europe to Asia and Asia back to Europe for various goods. Depending upon where you were in Europe and how condensed your population was, right? In an urban population, these cities start to grow in these centuries. You could expect 30 to 70% of your city, right, to die. It takes 200 years for the world's population to come back to the same level pre-plague. And to put that in perspective, right, I'm getting close to 50. I can remember when the world's population was about 4.5 billion, right? And now we're approaching 8 billion. And that's just 4 decades worth, right? So it takes 200 years for the world to match its population in terms of what happens. That's how devastating that was. Now, the other thing that's devastating about the plague is if you received, right, if you received and came in contact with this, there was no cure. You were going to die, right? You were going to die. So here is a look. Hopefully you haven't had too much for breakfast yet, but here's a look at the symptoms and what goes through. It's a little bit graphic. If you don't want to watch, you can just listen. Ding, ding, ding.
The delirious victim staggers about in his final moments. His speech is slurred, skin purple-black, covered with swollen, pus-filled lumps as death calls him. Witnesses to this terrifying spectacle called it the Dance Macabre, or Dance of Death. In the 14th century, a terrible catastrophe fell upon Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa that would change the course of history. The Black Death. The Black Death, or bubonic plague, was an outbreak of disease that killed 1/3 of the European population in the period 1347 to 1350. It had a similarly devastating impact in Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. The disease played no favorites. Rich and poor, young and old, priest and peasant, all fell victim to this horrible and, at the time, unexplained sickness, which was spreading like wildfire. The populations of entire towns and villages were wiped out in a matter of days. The dead were buried in mass graves to cope with the rapid death toll. Only a thin covering of soil was placed over the dead bodies before another layer was buried on top. Pope Clement VI consecrated, made sacred, the Rhone River so corpses could be thrown straight into it. So, what is the Black Death? Where did it come from? While it's difficult to trace with any real certainty, the outbreak is believed to have originated in the Gobi Desert in Mongolia, early in the 14th century. Prior to this, the disease had existed for centuries in regions of Asia, with small outbreaks occurring from time to time. Any one of these could have been the source. Once infected, the victim would first experience a high fever, aching limbs, and fatigue. Within days, the lymph nodes in the neck, armpits, and groin would start to swell and turn black. These black swellings are where the Black Death gets its name. Michael Placentius, first-hand witness to the horrors of the Black Death, wrote, "Here, not only the burn blisters appeared, but there have developed gland boils on the groin, the thighs, the arms, or on the neck. At first, these were the size of a hazelnut and developed accompanied by violent shivering fits, which soon rendered those attacks so weak that they could not stand up, but were forced to lie in their beds, consumed by violent fever. The boils grew to be the size of a walnut, then to that of a hen's egg or a goose's egg, and they were exceedingly painful and irritated the body, causing the sufferer to vomit blood. The sickness lasted 3 days, and on the 4th, the latest, the patient succumbed." The stinking pus-filled swellings, otherwise known as buboes, gave the bubonic plague its name. The nervous system under attack, victims would become crazed and delirious with fever. Once the swollen lymph nodes started to burst within the body, the sufferer was not long for this world. Death usually occurred within the week. By the time the infected person who had introduced the disease to the port, town, or village died, others would already be in the early stages of infection. This made preventing an epidemic incredibly difficult. The outbreak of the Black Death in the 14th century actually involved 3 different strains of plague. The most common and visually the most gruesome form is the bubonic plague. The second form was the pneumonic plague. It infects the respiratory system once the bubonic strain reaches the lungs. The third form, septicemic plague, infects the body's circulatory system, that is, the blood. The bubonic plague is actually the weakest of the 3 strains. During the worst outbreaks of the Black Death, pneumonic and septicemic plague had mortality rates of almost 100%. It's believed malnutrition played a major role in making the symptoms more dramatic. Many who died had endured years of famine, the result of severe storms and drought, making their weakened immune system vulnerable.
Right? Just crazy. Just crazy. And so if you can imagine, in all parts of the world, really, North America, South America really weren't that affected because you had really none of the explorers moving over there yet. A little bit in the some parts of Africa. Europe, it was the worst. Asia was the next worst. But Asia is a little bit more spread out, obviously the largest continent that we have on Earth. So coming out of basically 200 years of darkness, right, where people are getting this and dying, you have some hope. And what happens is a period called the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is a period basically meaning rebirth and sort of a rebirth of society. The plague all of a sudden seems to go away. Nobody knows why. And people start to look at the things that we talked about last unit. The ancient Greek ideals about democracy and one person, one vote. The ancient ideas of Rome, right, where you are a citizen of the state. You're not a ward of a particular society. You're not a subject of a ruler. And so those sort of things move in and move throughout. And so what you have during this rebirth, right, is people start to reject the idea that life is only a preparation for the afterlife. They start preparing men for public service instead of service to the church, right? So public service to your society, to your community. Study of earlier writings led to the idea of human achievement and potential, and that is looking way back at the ideas about Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. And his thoughts about questioning things. Why is it this way? Why is this the right way? You see start to take hold. And then you see these massive examples in architecture. And we'll show you a couple of examples of that. But you have huge dome structures where basically during this time period, they figure out how to support the weight of a dome in this time period. You have political power and the role of government. People start to question how should things be organized now. You have a number of people, Martin Luther, we'll talk about that next week, where they start to question the Catholic Church. And then at this time, this is the preeminent church in the world, especially in Europe during this time. And then you have people and new classes, the artisan class basically, artists, explorers, at the top of society, and lots of these city-states throughout Italy and some parts of Europe are these merchant capitalists. Now that the plague is gone and trade between Europe and Asia starts to take place, and you have more reliable travel via the Mediterranean Sea and these sea routes, you have merchant capitalists start to acquire a bunch of wealth. And so they start wielding a bunch of power. So in your Canvas module, go ahead and click next and make sure you get to the next part where we're at. So a question was asked in the chat room about the plague in terms of why did it go away after 200 years. One of the biggest reasons is the plague in terms of hygiene in places where there's bad hygiene, rats, rodents, things like that, is pretty transferable. And so as people in those 200 years sort of advance and make better dwellings, it sort of keeps the rodents out so they're not as easily infected. You have large percentages of the population, anywhere between 30 and 70% that die, and you just don't have as many people grouped together, right? And the trade had basically stopped, right? Because everybody was afraid to go outside. Everybody was afraid to intermingle. And so basically just from sheer numbers and time, it goes down to almost nothing. Right? Better hygiene, fewer people to transmit that, fewer interactions across a wider range. So, you know, remember, it's only until probably 100, 150 years ago that people would even travel, say 20, 25 miles from where they were born, right? You don't have transportation systems. You have horses and some boats, right? So the majority of people, right, well over 80%, don't travel very much out of a very small circle from where they're born, right? Where now you can get a plane, LAX, 10, 11 hours later, you're in Europe, right? You're on a different continent. You could be in Africa, etc. So that's one way to look at it. What I want to show you now is some examples of architecture. And then one of the things that really helps with the population boom is, especially in southern parts of Europe, they figure out how to provide clean drinking water throughout an entire city, right? Where, you know, you even see this today in areas that don't have very good delivery system for water. You get many waterborne diseases. Well, there's many in Italy that had figured out, hey, this is how we can deliver water in tunnels, which keeps diseases out and available. And in fact, when I went to Rome in April of 2019, they still had these fountains. They still had the fountains that were built nearly 1,000 years ago. It is just absolutely crazy. So let me show you some examples of that.
After the Dark Ages, Italy lit up the world. It emerged from a devastating cloud of the Black Death and brought innovation, spectacle, and the glorification of man. It was an explosion of new ideas from some of the greatest minds of all time.
Filippo Brunelleschi was the ingenio, the ingenious man.
It produced some of the greatest works of architecture, art, and engineering the world has ever known.
The enterprise of Renaissance engineering is recovering this ancient knowledge.
I don't think that any other period in the history of Western civilization can brag to having produced so much genius.
But achieving such genius was a struggle, as builders battled unprecedented natural disaster, church dogma, and each other.
And the Italian Peninsula becomes the cockpit, the fighting point.
This was the age of architects, and it created a bold new sense that nothing was impossible. (476 AD), the great Roman Empire has collapsed, ending its period of domination. The emperors who ruled and shaped the region have been dissolved, and Western Europe has become fractured. For centuries, Europe is dominated by a line of German kings who call their domain the Holy Roman Empire. But by the 12th century, a loose collection of Italian republics is taking shape. Together, they aim to recover the past glory of Rome. They would revitalize Europe and engineer the blueprint for the modern Western world.
Hi, I'm Peter Weller. And in 2001, I came here to the city of Florence to finish a master's degree in Italian Renaissance art history at Syracuse University in Florence. The Italian Renaissance is as overwhelmingly mind-blowing as it is beautiful. It is the most impacting epoch of the last millennium. It is the age of invention with Da Vinci and Copernicus and Gutenberg, but it is also the age of the cult of personality. It is the time when that unknown artisan or craftsman will become the artist. It is the time when that nameless builder will become the architect.
Right, so if you look at the dome, over his left shoulder, that's the sort of architecture that we are talking about in terms of what is available to them. Lastly, let me show you the greatest importance in terms of being able to build large cities, and that is going to be the development of clean water. So let me skip ahead to that part.
Around this campo, 90 seconds of speed and violence on bareback horses. When the horses run, they pass this magnificent 15th century sculpted fountain called the Fontpaglia by Jacopo della Quercia. Now today, when we turn on a tap, we just take it for granted that H2O is going to come out. But the CNEs needed this fountain because when they were making all this loot, prosperity begets a city jam-packed with people, and more people.
So that those fountains right there in Rome still exist. So more than 1,000 years later, I had a water bottle, had a cup, just go right there, turn that fountain on, and it is fresh water that came through these tunnels that he's going to show you how they built.
Demands, as we have seen with Persia, with Carthage, with Rome, with the Maya. More water.
But providing sufficient water for this city would prove to be a massive challenge.
Siena doesn't have a river very close, so they had to find this water somewhere else. They thought that they could find another way to go and search for water. And that way was building some tunnels underground.
By digging a network of underground tunnels called bottini, the workers could tap into small natural springs and groundwater that surrounded Siena. Slowly, the water would seep through the terrain into these narrow tunnels and holding tanks. But excavating these bottini was no easy task. Workers used shovels, picks, and chisels to chip away at the calcite deposits in the tunnel, working in dark, dusty conditions, often no more than a few feet high.
A bottino like this one would sometimes run for miles and miles, so the engineers had to know just where in the heck they were going. So every so often they dug a hole up to the surface, and these holes were called occhi, or eyes. It would give the engineer a sense of where the direction of the bottino would be, and if they were wrong, they could redirect the bottino.
The water would navigate through the barrel-shaped tunnels, turning into different parts of the city where it was needed most, and coursing underneath the busy streets into the fountains around Siena, like the Fonte Gaia.
Now, these channels had to be pitched at an angle ever so slight, imperceptible to the naked eye, less than 1 degree, because if the water flowed too steeply, it would overwhelm the system. So to keep this from happening, the engineers used an instrument called an archipendulum. It's nothing but a pendulum. It's a stick with a string and a weighted ball or stone at the end. No matter how much you pitch the stick, the string will always remain vertical, giving you a vertical line in a relationship to the tilt of the horizontal stick. In this way, the water would flow quietly and evenly into Siena and fill up the Fonte Gaia.
By the year 1345, more than 10 miles of tunnels were functioning underneath bustling Siena. As a result, Siena continued to grow and prosper.
More water brought more people to the boom town. More people to the boom town, more turf is needed. Pretty soon, Siena controls most of southern Tuscany. Now, this prosperity and this land encroachment, if you will, would seriously become the burr in the saddle to one of its neighbors.
So, water as a source is going to be the most important thing for urban development. And you can see this even in the United States, right? If you look at cities like Phoenix, Phoenix is the 5th largest city now in the United States. In the 1950s and 1960s, it was well under 600,000 people. Las Vegas now has a metropolitan area of well over 2 million people. It was in the low thousands in the 50s and 60s. And what changes is the availability and the delivering of water. So you have Lake Mead, right? And the Hoover Dam that is built just southeast of Vegas. You have the Central Arizona Project, which is a canal system finished in the 80s that brings water from the Colorado River over to Phoenix. And when you have water, even in present day examples, you see metropolitan areas really grow in population. And that's sort of why you see this rebirth. On your canvas, go ahead and click on next and get to the next spot. All right, and the last thing I want to show you is probably the most important invention, maybe in the history of the world, because of what it means. And that is the Gutenberg printing press, a movable type printing press. So the sharing of this information, right, this time period of rebirth of Greek and Roman ideals and architecture and art and merchant capitalist, all the things that are going on, you have Gutenberg, who basically develops a movable type printing press, which allows you to print books much faster at much greater speed. And basically the Gutenberg Bible becomes the most popular, widespread book in the world. And this is what it looked like, and this is how it changed printing, say books from hand to books by a non-movable type printing press to a movable type printing press, and this will show you what that means.
Paper had just been invented in China and come to Europe through Italy. Paper had just been invented in China and come to Europe through Italy. Now the paper was being made for use by the scribes, and so it was hard and slick. Didn't work very well with Gutenberg's oil-based ink, and so he had to dampen the paper to soften it up. So he actually printed on slightly dampened paper. If he just laid a sheet on like that and rolled it under there and did an impression, he could lay every piece on exactly the same, especially when he prints on the back. He's got to line those columns up exactly. So that's the next big problem he has to solve. What's the answer to that? Well, here it is right here, the tympan and the frisket. So we'll open that up. This is called a tympan. It's just leather over a frame, which provides a place for us to put our paper on. And these little points called duckbills position it up and down. And then we have a mark here for left and right. Now watch this. This is very important. These pins poke through the paper. And when he prints on the other side, he puts the paper back on through those same holes, and that gives him exact register from front to back. So those columns are lined up perfectly. Now he has to have something to hold the paper against the tympan. It's called the frisket. We fold it down. It's got out there where we're going to print, and it also allows us to lift that paper back up off that sticky type without tearing it or smearing it. So now we're ready to fold the tympan and frisket down over our inky type. Ready to roll the whole head of the press underneath the platen. The platen is this big flat board that's going to lower to press the paper against the ink type. Now the press has the screw device, the flat board, and the handle that turns the screw, and that's going to lower the platen and press the paper against the ink type. The person that did this was called the puller. So we're going to make a motion here. And notice the size of the platen is really quite small, because the bigger the platen is, the more power it takes to get sufficient impression. And so we've only printed the first page there. So we've got to roll it out, print the second page. Roll it out. Lifts the paper off that sticky type, and it does make a sound here, come off that sticky type. We open up the and take our printed sheet off. And then we printed 2 pages of the Gutenberg Bible and a genuine copy of the Gutenberg press using real Gutenberg type.
seems very simple to us, right, in this time period. But in that time period where you have sort of this rebirth and people examining and questioning politics and religion, and people now worried about life instead of survival through the 200 years of the Black Plague, this is a major change in society in terms of how ideas spread, right? We can take books from one spot to another. We can create books quickly and get many copies out. And you see the level of literacy rise, the amount of information shared rise as well. Go ahead and click on next. If you want to see that Renaissance video where Peter Weller is talking about the architecture and all of the tunnels that were built, the full video link is right there. And you can go ahead and click on next. We'll talk about what you need to do before we meet next Thursday. Okay. So as I said, the most important thing is to check here and make sure that everything for your basically progress report, your grade submission, the grade report that's going to be sent home is done. So you can check your assignments, check Aries because that's the one that's up to date. And then after everything's done, as I said, you can see that I kept the due date on this much later than it normally would be just because I want you to focus on, right, the other things that are going to be due and posted in your grades that go out on those grade reports Monday. So the due date for this assignment as well as the map assignment is not until a week from Friday. And it's open until October 2nd. So you're going to look at Unit 3, Chapter 13, or Lesson 13, I think they might call it, Section 1. So there are questions over, let me erase that real quick. There are questions over the Renaissance. And so in your digital textbook, I'll show you an example here. Right, so if you go to Unit 3, Transformations in Europe. So Unit 3, Lesson 13, get to the text. You're going to go down to the Renaissance, which is Section 1. There are 4 questions here. It talks a little bit about architecture and all of the things that are going on in the area of Europe, really northern parts of Europe versus southern Italy. And then there's 4 questions, right? What does the term Renaissance mean? Why is it described this period? 5 reasons why the Renaissance originated in Italy. Complete this statement from the perspective of each of the people listed there. And then how did the ideas of Renaissance transform Europe, right? So once you're done with that, right? Once you're done with that, you can do a couple of things. When you click on Turn In, and so if this, let me get to a student view, because I think that'll be easier for you to see. This is how you can turn it in through Canvas. Right, so use your username. Make sure that you put mine in there. So it's Unit 3, Lesson 13, and I believe Section 1. And so after you fill in your answers, right? After you fill in your answers, you're going to turn this Turn In button. All right. So right? Renaissance, as we said, means rebirth, right? So let's say that I am ready to turn that in. When I turn that in, you're going to get, yes, turn it in. It's going to tell you, right? Once you turn that in, if you go up here and copy your URL, right? The web address up here, Control C. After you select that, you can go down here and you can put a screenshot up before, but I opened up all of these entries. You can put the URL and I can click on that and it'll take me right to your responses. Or you can go to website URL, copy and paste that, submit that assignment, and it'll show up as ready to go, right? Show up as ready to go. Click on next and make sure you're able to see the blue submit button. Somebody asked in the chat room about these assignments. These two assignments for this week over the Renaissance and the Black Death, because their due dates are after the grading period, they will not count on this 6 weeks grade. All right, will not count on this 6 weeks grade. And then if you're able to see that blue submit button, you're good. You can click on next. And this is your 16 identifications. All right, so if you click on the map of Europe, there's 16 spots that you need to know. There's a list of them there. There's their location on the map, and there's the guide that you will use. Same thing, after you've submitted all of that, right, you have the submit button down there and that box comes up, do the same thing. Control C, go here, submit your assignment. You can submit it in website URL, hit submit, right? And that'll show up in Canvas and show that it's ready to go.